по інфоназві, АНС чи
АНС,
АНТС.
Так. Ну, якщо англійською, то вимагається цю абревіатуру по буквах. А якщо так, щоб сильно не заморочитися, то АНС.
Як мурашки?
Да?
Мурашки.
Так, це так. Задумано було, щоб абревіатура і логотипі мурашка.
Якась громадська організація вже має таку абревіатуру.
Так. Всі зібралися, дружно потягнули гусінь, мурашник розбирати на запчастини.
Добрий день.
Добрий.
Сісуй.
Це 24 травня.
Today is May 24, Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform starts its operation. My name is Vasil Samakholov, and right now we will be talking about the damage inflicted on ecology, on environment, the damage inflicted by the Russians and how should they pay for it, and how do we calculate the losses. Well, the people we will be talking to are Oleg Listopad, its National Interest Advocacy Network, Mr. Oleksandr Stavniychuk, Department Head of the Ministry of Ecology and Natural Resources of Ukraine, Dmytro Zaruba, First Deputy Head of the State Environmental Inspectorate of Ukraine, Bohdan Mazurok, Representative of the Specialized Environmental Department of the Ukrainian Prosecutor General's Office, and joining us online will be Andrii Demydenko, member of the working group under the operational headquarters of the State Environmental Inspectorate of Ukraine, who will give us more detail about the figures. So let's start with Mr. Oleg. Well, the question is very simple. Everything going on, we see it, we see Gerald Hatch, we see burnt out trees, we see terrible stories from Auskaniano, we see the stories with the dolphins. We observe the blown up dams. We understand that the damage is incredible, and we understand someone should be brought liable for this. The presentation, please. Well, on this slide you can see the consequences of the two Russian missiles incoming into a petroleum silo in Kalinivka in March last year. A lot of oil has burnt out back then, and there was a huge spillage of oil which got into nearest water reservoirs. The environmental inspections took samples when it has become safe, and there was an exceed of oil content in all samples. All of the fish has died out in the nearest lake, and us, together with the representatives of the environmental inspection, with Mr. Prosecutor present here, the state environmental inspection took samples one more time, and there was a number of hazardous substances exceeding the standard by a number of indicators. So we cannot use that water anymore. The people living nearby, they have substantial problems now, and the prosecutor's office opened the case upon this. But whether the perpetrators who were launching the missiles, who were giving commands, whether they would be brought to liability, whether they will be imprisoned, or will Russia pay for the damage inflicted on that area, how to calculate that loss, how to seek the enforcement, those are the matters we are about to discuss tomorrow. So first of all, to what extent are we going to be able to bring to liability Russia as a state? Another slide which demonstrates that after 14 months, the situation still remains critical. A part of this case, within the last year there were 16 criminal cases opened in Kherson region, and other regions as well. If it were as for a saboteur whom we could capture and imprison, just like we imprison other Russian criminals, it would have been easier. But the criminals who were given orders, who were launching the missiles, they are beyond our jurisdiction. So we have to ponder over the question how to use the international mechanisms, specifically Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which stipulates in the Article 8 war crimes. Stipulates the damage to the environment, so we can work with that article. Well, the wording is pretty comprehensive, however not clear enough, and the practice is actually not in place for ecocide. There is no such practice in place with the International Criminal Court, so if we make it, we will be pioneers in this area. There is an article, for example, which allows us, if there are no international mechanisms, so we can use National Criminal Code Article 441, and it seems like everything is clear, the mass extinction. But when you go to a more profound level, we don't understand what is mass extinction. What is mass? How do we calculate it? What are the figures? Again, the article is not clear enough. And the practice that we have, well, it's pretty modest. The case was handed, the ecocide case was handed over to the court. All of the environmentalists, they keep talking about it. Within the last 5 years, the poison of rivers Homochi and Homora, there is just one industrial facility located there who drops their waste into the rivers, and anybody can come to a conclusion why those rivers were transformed into canals within the last 5 years. So we have to keep working to improve the legislation. We see that we will be able to achieve something if we make it clearer. I was an aide to People's Deputy Ostap Yednik. We were working on legislation in a couple of criminal cases. So the clearer it is worded in the law, the easier it is for the judges to bring up the judgment. And our environmentalists in Ecology and Human Rights Network, they were working a lot on it, along with the international organizations, and still proceeding to some concrete steps. We have to eventually ratify the Rome Statute. Without it, the efficient work, efficient influence on the creation of government bodies, amendment of legislation is quite problematic. Specifically, what we're trying to seek, we want to amend the claims with the 5th international war crime. We have to develop the mechanisms to bring the perpetrators to liability and how to transform it into some specific wordings, and to establish specific bodies who will deal with those problems. We have working contacts with the Prosecutor's office, with our colleagues, so we hope with this press conference we will be able to draw attention of those who are not yet engaged and continue to coordinate our efforts. I understand, just to summarize, if I'm allowed, there are 3 challenges. Is the accounting, Ukrainian legislative field, second, because we have to understand what is mess, what is not mess, what is evidence, what is not evidence, and the 3rd track is the international cooperation, bringing Russia to liability in international courts, because we understand that in Ukraine we may be unable to bring some Russians to liabilities. So, talking about calculation of losses, let's ask Mr. Oleksandr, to what extent is the ministry calculating the losses? What is the damage inflicted in Ukraine in figures and facts? Good morning, thank you for your question. The work is underway in this area. You know, we have 7 methods, 7 techniques that are promulgated in national level. The state environmental inspection calculates the losses according to those techniques. The atmospheric, air, soil, water, aquatories, forests, natural reserves, and for the time being there are almost 2 trillion hryvnias of losses. In water, atmosphere and soil, as to the natural reserves, the losses are equal to almost 6 trillion hryvnias, so the work is underway, but we still understand that the main goal is to enforce reparations. I apologize. No, it's okay, no problem. So we have to enforce reparations for all those losses, and obviously we want to unify all those approaches. On the international level, to make it happen, Ministry of Environment works with a number of international organizations. We gather information, we gather all the works by international experts along with our experts. They have something in development, and all those techniques that are available now, they will be amended, they will be altered. After the amendments are being developed, there is an operational headquarters where about 6 experts work. So international experts work with our experts to improve those techniques to the maximum extent possible, and our key task today is to gather all the studies, together the cases. It won't be a great problem to list everything. What we have to focus on is to have the evidence base to be able to enforce the reparations for them. Well, it would be logical for Mr. Dmytro to continue about the headquarters, the collection of evidences, and what are the challenges you're facing in your work. Good morning, I appreciate the invitation. The State Environmental Inspection is a body identified by the government to document the evidences related to the impact of the Russian aggression on the environment. In the March last year, the operational headquarters was created at Ecological Environmental Inspection, which included the representatives of the central bodies of the executive authorities, representatives of the Prosecutor's office, and other law enforcement agencies, along with people deputies, Ukrainian and international experts. Just like Mr. Oleksandr mentioned, there is a working group which includes about 60 leading Ukrainian and international experts who help us in improvement the techniques which were developed earlier and approved by the Ministry of Environmental Protection. Regarding the complications, the complexities, to calculate something, in the most cases you have to get to the area which was affected, where the territories are deoccupied and where we got the approval by the State Emergency Service. Our inspectors may go out in the field and take samples, and upon then calculate the losses. Like Mr. Oleksandr mentioned, about 2 trillions of losses are calculated already in the areas that we work in, but it's a minor fraction. The more and more environment is affected. For example, how to calculate the environmental losses inflicted in Bakhmut. So the State Environmental Inspection keeps working on it. We continue to add details to the Echo thread, the web resource developed by the Ministry of Environmental Protection, but our experts, a part of documenting those losses by themselves, they also document the losses within the framework of the criminal cases, which is the information not to be promulgated until the cases are finalized. So state environmental inspection is now part of the European community in Poland, the organization that unites state environmental inspections of the European countries. So we sent our techniques to them so they check them, because we had too little time to develop those techniques, and those techniques still need improvement, because the time is needed to understand how the technique works and how to improve it. Well, thank you. I propose to have Mr. Andrii join our conversation. Mr. Andrii, are you hearing us? Yes, I hope you're hearing us too. We would like to talk to you about the techniques. To what extent do they correspond with the challenges? What should be amended? What should be changed? What can you say about them as a specialist? Well, first of all, thank you for mentioning the expert council and the working group. It operates for more than 1 year now, and the main problem, on my opinion, that it's not being heard. We had to fight for 1 year so that our recommendations are being heard. Just recently we had a session of the council to identify whether those techniques are eligible. And one of the summaries that we came up to, one of the conclusions, is that Ukrainian techniques just don't fit for enforcement of reparations. I will give you just a small, short explanation of the problem. About the ecocide, there is only criminal liability for ecocide. There is no compensation contemplated for ecocide, neither in Ukrainian nor in international legislation. So you can put someone in prison, but you cannot enforce any compensation from them. What should we do? We should not think that the techniques developed by the environmental inspection will help us with that. This is the work that should be planned on a high national level, on the level of top officials. To get any compensation for the environmental losses and damage, we have to have the notion of the term of environmental losses and damage identified. There is no such identification in the Ukrainian legislation. So these are the two problems that I'm talking about. And the third problem is we cannot think that we can solve this problem as a result of the work of the civil organization which works without payment. For example, after the war of Iraq in Kuwait, there was a commission established which worked 30 years until they resolved everything. And the working group that you mentioned, they said that the best case we have to pay attention to and to understand what should be done. Just like Mr. Oleg just mentioned, the oil spillage, how much oil products burned out during that conflict, as they say, within this year. Can anybody estimate this figure? I don't know. Maybe someone can. But what was the amount of the oil products that burned out during the war of Iraq in Kuwait? So it was 9 million tons, you see? So to understand where we are, we have to go to, or we have to appeal to international context. I can continue talking about figures and so on, but the first attempt to get compensation for the damage of the Ukrainian air and atmosphere, just like Ukraine did with the, just like Ukrainian president did in Sharm el-Sheikh, when we said we need 1 billion for compensation for the damage to the air and atmosphere, we were asked, what is your evaluation based on? So we said that is the figure of under-received ecological text by the emissions by Russian Federation. And they said, why do you consider under-received text as an environmental damage, atmospheric damage? So I'm talking here about the damage to the atmosphere. Here we have no chances at all. And talking about the rest, for what I understand, it was already said. The group of experts worked there. I work with that group. They are able to continue talking about that. But again, we have to forget about this damage to the atmosphere already. But talking about other factors, that's a different conversation. And there will be a London conference in a month. So I hear no conversations in preparation to this conference about the techniques to be told about during this conference. If we don't talk about those techniques during London conference, that it will be postponed for another period. Well, thank you. I'll be wrapping up. We can share our recommendations by the environmental inspection and by the working group, which were developed during the conference dedicated to those matters. I'm ready to answer your questions and continue conversation. Thank you. Thank you. Please stay tuned. The London conference will be happening in a month. It will be dedicated to the reconstruction of Ukraine. Then another question to Mr. Bohdan. We've just heard interesting information that our techniques don't influence a lot. So another question will be about our legal track, both in Ukrainian law enforcement agencies, and maybe you can say what this track should look like beyond our jurisdictions, what it should be based upon, what are the perspectives to not only bring someone to liability but also to enforce the compensation. Good morning, thank you for the invitation. In continuation of previous speakers' addresses, I would like to say that techniques occupy a lot of space in our activities. They are the lever which defines our further direction in terms of working on the crimes, on bringing to liability of the perpetrators, and to enforcing the compensation for the crimes committed. In part of the techniques, it was said right by the specialist who voiced this problem. But the problem is that us, as the prosecutor's office, the body which from the beginning of the full-scale invasion is active in documenting those criminal activities, specifically the damage inflicted on the environment. Now we are in active phase of documenting of those criminal activities, but a lot of work is done by the specialists from the environmental inspections and other specialists which understand something in documenting of losses inflicted on the environment. So we're talking about the possibility to document the crimes within those mechanisms and to enforce compensation within that mechanism. As to the international experience, our war is unprecedented, and specifically in terms of damage to the environment, we have to evaluate the experience that was acquired by the mentioned specialists in part of Kuwait, for example, or Costa Rica, but we have our specifics and we have to work based on the realities that we have now. The techniques, they acquire more improvement in terms of application within the international framework and in terms of regulation. The way it is interpreted in the Geneva Convention, in the protocols to the Geneva Convention, and in the Rome Statute, there is some unclarity in the terms. There is a lack of criteria which identify it as an international crime. It's a key problem in our investigations now, because the fact of sampling evidences, it should rely upon certain criteria. As to the further prospects, they will be based on the ability to acquire proper evidences, which involves case activities and to documenting of the scale of the losses. And we have to also prove that the damage is not only calculated, but it should take into account the everlasting nature of the damage. We have to engage a number of specialists of different levels and different specialties that are even absent in Ukraine. This should be taken into account too. For the time being, it's something that requires the fruitful work with engagement of a broad circle of specialists, including the representatives of international organizations. Well, thank you, but then the question would be, what should Ukrainian system look like to, for example, to bring the Russians to liability? Who should be the subject? Who should be collecting the information? What information should it be? Whom should we report this information to? Who should approve any judgment to convict Russians and to enforce the compensation? So what should we do? Well, it's an interesting question, and it's a very complex question which includes a number of actions. Well, collecting evidences, it's the responsibility of the law enforcement agencies, but law enforcement agencies, their activities, they should rely upon the opinion of some specialists, the experts, for example, in part of the damage to the environment. The investigation should be going on a national level. In our national course should be coming up with the judgments to give a legal assessment of the actions committed by the perpetrators, and also those activities in some resonating cases, in some serious cases, it should be given by the international organizations. So, for example, now we're discussing the option of creating the special tribunal. It's a very good remark, by the way. This work should be developed as well. So we have to approach it in a complex manner with engagement of our specialists, our experts again. It should be taken into account too, and also to be taken into account is the availability of international practice, international experience, like the experience of Yugoslavia. There was a case in the territory of continental Europe. There were other cases in the world. So again, we have to focus on the availability of the techniques and some in complex activities that we have to use. Well, I have to get back to Mr. Demydenko's words that we won't be able to make it alone. We have already information about the creation of register by international partners, of which documents the losses inflicted by Russian Federation. So we have to keep working to create a section in that register related to the damage on the environment. So there should be also an international body created which would include international level, global level experts who would develop the techniques which would be recognized in the international level. Well, the body is similar to the one which was established after the war in Kuwait. So again, it will be up to us to collect the evidences. But for whom should we collect the evidences? What I would also like to mention, Mr. Andrii, if you want to add something, please raise your hand. We're seeing you, and if we see your hand raised, we will know that we should give the floor to you. So whom should we appeal to? Well, we have to create an international body which will deal with these problems. Because if we calculate it for ourselves and we say, okay, this is the figure we come up with, it will be up to us to prove the correctness of the figures, the correctness of the techniques we were using. So it's already on this stage that we should involve the international partners not only to work on our level, but go level up on the international level. It requires legislative amendments. But still we should do it now, and we should put it frankly that, okay guys, we cannot do it on our own. Let's not get ashamed. Let's not say that we are the coolest ones. We calculated 2 trillion of losses, so give us these 2 trillion in reparations. Right, again, the question is, so who should be those guys who should help us? Who are the international organizations which can support us in this effort? And another track is this International Criminal Court and Rome Statute that we were discussing. So we know about the order of International Criminal Court, which was issued without ratification and so on and so forth, and it was an extensive work by the civil sector, because it was civil sector who was submitting the reports and who was drawing International Criminal Court's attention to the crimes committed. For example, they were drawing their attention to abduction of Ukrainian children. Could we go along the same track? Could we report to International Criminal Court, which could create a precedent, create a case, and to issue the warrant to arrest the perpetrators, the guilty ones? Well, ecocide is not something that is being committed during war only, but there is a number of things in the world that result in significant losses to the environment. There is a Stop Ecocide international team of legal experts who submit their proposals. They work on wordings, they work on mechanisms. We have to cooperate with them. There are reputed international organizations in the United States who have an extensive experience of enforcing compensation for losses to the environment. Mr. Andrii knows personally several people from there, our colleagues. They have direct contacts with them. So let's say it for ourselves. Let us do it this way. Let's not stay in our pond, so to say. There are specialists available. We just shouldn't be ashamed to appeal to them and to ask for their help. Mr. Andrii, we know that you want to add something. Thank you very much. I want to add something for a long time. Yeah, it's an interesting discussion, but before we ask for help, we have to do some homework. We have to change the paradigm. I apologize for this scientific term. How can we ask someone for compensation for environmental liability if there is no environmental liability in place in international legislation? We have criminal liability, but we don't have environmental liability. Before we ask for someone else's help, we have to create this term within our legislation. How can we ask for help if we don't have a term of environmental damage? Is the damage to the environment or damage to the people resulted from the environment? Because the majority of institutions, they consider environmental damage as the damage to the people from the environment, and the majority of the international organizations, they see environmental damage as the damage to the environment inflicted by the people. So before we ask for their help, we should identify that term in our legislation, just in the same way that when we are talking about Putin, he's out of this world, so he's from a different world. So in the same way, if we put it this way, that environmental damage is the damage to the people from the environment, if we ask someone for support with this definition, they will say you're the first grade, you have nothing to talk to. So if you're the we will be asked whether we want to compensate the losses to the human life and health or the damage to the environment. Well, I'm talking about the basic things. The work is underway. The environmental inspection, the Ministry of Environment keep working. I was talking to the legislators. For example, do you see in Constitution compensation for the damage to the environment is not envisaged in principle? in the constitution. So before we ask for their support, we have to think about our own thing. We should start working in this level. In the international legislation, in the European Union, the damage to the environment is identified as a measurable change of the natural resource or measurable change of the ecosystem service related to this resource. The measurable negative change of the natural resource or measurable deterioration of the service related to that resource. Mr. Strelets, when he was asked about this in Sharm el-Sheikh, he said, we don't have ecosystem legislation at all. And everybody just left the press conference. So people have not identified what is ecosystem in their legislation, and you come to the representatives of the civilized world to ask about the deterioration, for compensation for deterioration of ecosystems. Well, it's homework. No criminal court, no UNEP will do it for us. We have to do it on our own. We have ecocide. We have ecocide in our legislation. But again, there is no material compensation contemplated for ecocide, only criminal liability. Do we want to put Putin in prison for that, or do we want to enforce reparations for that? So first we have to do our homework. How can we appeal to international court if we cannot do it even within our court? When we say, like, let's establish the hybrid tribunal which will work within the legal framework of Ukrainian legislation, and they say, no, we cannot do it. We cannot do it by ourselves. And why? Because we don't have those terms in our legislation, so we have to do our homework. Don't expect anybody to do our homework for us. This problem, the change of constitution in terms of what to amend it with the terms of environmental damage, we have a number of such things that originate from maturing back in Soviet times. Nobody amends it. Does UNEP have to do it for us? No, it's our homework again. I want to add it to what Mr. Oleg says. This work can be done right here, right now. I don't see any working group which would gather and say, okay guys, let's see what should be changed in our legislation. Collection of evidences by the prosecutor's office, I was asking, what percentage of the calculated environmental tax is really collected? 2.5%. Rest of the tax is not, well, by the way, how much is it in absolute figures? It's 4 billion hryvnias per year. So in fact you try to collect 2.5 billion, in fact you collect 100 millions, and you ask the international community for 2 trillions. Well, they checked through those figures and they asked respectively, if you calculate 4 billions, you collect like 100 million, and you ask the international community to give you 2 trillion. Well, it's not the way it's gonna happen. You cannot come up to the international level with the figures like that. You have to make order at home and then come up to an international level. I apologize for putting it this way, but I work with them and this is what I see. Those figures are no secret to anybody, so how can you come up to the international level with this figure? So don't do it, just bring your home in order. I apologize for being maybe a bit too emotional, but again, in London summit, what will we present there? I apologize. There will be a plan of Ukrainian recovery in terms of environmental security. Everybody is asking, why is it environmental security? Everybody is asking, why do you need recovery in environmental security? Why not recovery of the environment? But it's because this is the way it's worded in our legislation. But we should understand first what is environmental security. I can quote it, what is environmental security. If you give me another minute, I will quote what is environmental security in Ukrainian legislation. This is how it's put back from Soviet time. It's the condition of environment which prevents the deterioration of ecological situation and posing of threats to human health. It's a nonsense. There is no such thing that there is a condition which prevents to the emergence of threats, because any activities may pose a threat. But this is how it's worded in our legislation. So they say, sorry, but there is no such condition of environment that poses no threat to human health. So going on an international level asking for money for that, it's impossible. Even back in maturing times it was like that, and now it's even more impossible. But we have not gone to that point within the last 30 years. We have to make amendments to our legislation. Thank you, Mr. Andrii. Thank you. So I would like to ask for the details. I thought you've come with some optimistic news, but the longer I am listening to you, the more pessimistic I'm growing. Okay, then there is a simple question. Is it real to enforce, is it possible to enforce the money for that compensation from Russia? Not tomorrow, not the day after tomorrow, but if we do that homework that Mr. Andrii is talking about, if we engage our international partners that we're talking about, well, you've heard the number of years that it was required to enforce the compensation from Iraq by Kuwait, but if we don't do anything, we'll receive nothing respectively. Well, then to what extent is it real? We document something, we publish the figures that are impressive on the level of headlines. For example, there would be headlines that the losses are calculated in amount of 2 trillion, but what should we do? How to enforce? Well, we work with the European directives, and the legislation in any case will be implemented in compliance with the European legislation. We just have to engage more efforts to expedite the process. Regarding the techniques, I want to thank once again to everybody who helps us. I invite everybody to take part. Please send your materials. We collect all of them. On the international level, there will be a mechanism adopted, and many institutions, including international ones, work on this issue. The work involves a number of experts. We will receive the mechanism shortly, and we will know for sure where to submit, where to report for compensation. Well, let's proceed to the questions from the floor. Good morning, Yana Koloda, Ukrinform. I'm having a question to Mr. Bohdan. When will we see the first appeals to the International Court regarding the ecocide in Ukraine? Will it be happening during the war or after the war? Because for what I understand, now you're collecting the cases and evidences. Thank you for the question. Now the investigation is underway by the facts of ecocide. And the situation is such that before the war, well, it's an unprecedented case. The case of ecocide is the case that was mentioned by Mr. Oleg. It was initiated first within the decades, the investigation under the case of ecocide. But under the conditions of war, under the conditions of armed conflict, those cases, they require, due to their specifics and complexity, they require proper work on them. As to the suits, the work is underway in this field. We continue collecting evidences. It's quite a difficult time. You know, we're the only one country that during active battle operations, during active battles, is engaged in investigations and in collecting evidences. Those are unprecedented cases, so investigation is still underway by those facts. Okay, so the question is, do you invite the international experts to cooperate in this area? Yes. We have consultations and we use the advice of international experts we cooperate in the area of war crimes with the international experts as well. Thank you very much. Do we have any more questions, or a little bit of details, the resolution 326 of the Cabinet of Ministers stipulates that it's Ministry of Justice who is responsible to submit to the international courts. So all the bodies that work on collection of evidences and submission of suits, it will be happening like this. So the main question is, what will be the mechanism, how the work should be going on the further phases. So we were talking to a number of experts, and they were saying it wouldn't constitute a million of cases. It would be just one joint suit that would include not only environmental damage, but the damage to infrastructure, health, and so on and so forth. So this process is being worked on by the Ukrainian lawyers, because really the cases of Costa Rica or Iraq and Kuwait are not that type of legal relations that fits the situation of Ukraine. The biggest scale threat posed by Russian invasion it has such a broad scale that none of the countries has ever faced since World War II. For example, the demining part, France, which was a place of the battles during the World War I, it still has red zones until now where you cannot work on the land, you cannot do anything there, because the losses to be inflicted on the environment should be calculated, because after the 100 years the territory is not yet demined. So we have to understand the scale of problems that we're facing. Like Mr. Andrii, for example, mentioned, the techniques that are available in Europe, that are in place in Europe, they are not fit for the martial law. For example, how can you get to that area? How can you get the details? Of course, now we have aerial photography. We can compare previous condition and current condition of forest resources, for example. And again, one of the Ukrainian public organizations, the experts calculated in Kharkiv per 1 square kilometer how many bombs were fallen per 1 square kilometer. It was about 480 projectiles incoming per 1 square kilometer. So it was 50,000 kilograms of iron only, of steel only. So calculate other hazardous substances. So it's a huge work by the environmentalists how to calculate those losses. Well, I'm having my last question before we wrap it up. For what I understand, we will pack it into a legal case, country against country. And Russia as a country will be brought liable, and not specific people who were given some criminal orders. Yeah, by the way, the case Iraq and Kuwait, only 4% were of the compensation amount were enforced, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you very much. If we have no more questions, let's wrap it up. We were talking about a very important thing, because there are stories which shock Ukraine and shock the world, and we have to understand how to deal with this. We will continue our work at 13 o'clock, and we will talk about the presentation of the documentary Ma 2. See you shortly.